Chapter 8 Operation Barbarossa. Hitler and Stalin had taken over Poland. They signed a pact in August 1933 that none would attack the other. It was known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Stalin relaxed. However, Hitler lied and had other plans. On June 22nd in 1941, the German offensive was launched by 3 army groups under the same commanders as in France in 1940. On the left, going to the north, an army group under General von Leeb struck from Ostpreußen, East Prussia, into the Baltic states toward Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. On the right, going to the south, another army group under General von Rundstedt, with an armored group under General von Kleist, advanced from southern Poland into the Ukraine against Kiev. From there, it was to wheel southeastward to the coast of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. The third army group in the center, the main blow was delivered by von Bock's army, with one armored group under General Guderian and another under General Hoth, thrusting northeastward at Smolensk and Moscow. This invasion along an 1,800-mile north-south front took Russia by complete surprise that caught the Red Army unprepared and partially demobilized. As part of the southern flank of Bock's group, Guderian's tanks raced 50 miles beyond the frontier on the first day of the invasion and were in Minsk 200 miles beyond it on June 27th. At Minsk, they converged with Hoth's tanks, which had attacked from the northern flank. Bock's infantry could not follow up fast enough to encircle the Soviet troops in the area. However, 300,000 prisoners were taken, but many of the Soviet forces were able to escape to the east. Guderian's tanks then, crossing the Dnieper River on July 10th, entered Smolensk 6 days later and converged with Hoth through Vitebsk. Here, 200,000 prisoners were taken. Some Soviet troops had been moved from this trap, and a large pocket of resistance lay behind the German armor. By mid-July, a series of rainstorms turned the roads into clogging mud, over which the wheeled vehicles of the German transport behind the German tanks could make very slow progress. Lacking oil, horses were being used to transport machinery or equipment, and to haul it out of the quagmire and later snow. Between Russia and Germany, 6 million horses were being used in World War II, from 1939 to 1945. In 2 months, Germany lost 179 million horses. Poor innocent beasts. Didn't Napoleon have the same trouble and had to turn back? The armies were also hampered by the scorched earth policy used by the retreating Soviets. They would burn crops, destroy bridges, evacuate factories. Entire steel and munition plants in the westernmost areas were dismantled and shipped by rail to the east, where they were put back into production. A very clever strategy. The Soviets also destroyed or moved their railroad cars so as not to be used by the enemy. The railroad gauge was a bit different than the German one, which made them useless for German equipment. This meant the German soldiers not being dressed for winter, as Hitler was sure he could take Russia as quickly as the other countries, were cut off from the supply lines. Many died of hunger or froze to death. Of course, Hitler did not want his people in Germany to know about these soldiers' inglorious deaths. Despite all this, the Germans had advanced more than 400 miles and were only 200 miles from Moscow. Hitler changed his mind to go into Moscow to converge with Leib's group at this time. His main interest lay in Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, and the Caucasus with its huge oil deposits. Germany heavily depended on these. A minor swing northward against Leningrad would let him converge with Leib's army group. In the Ukraine, meanwhile, Rundstedt and Kleist made short order of the foremost Soviet defenses. A new Soviet front south of Kiev was broken by the end of July, and in the next 2 weeks the Germans were sweeping down to the Black Sea with Romania simultaneous offensive. Kleist was then ordered to wheel northward from central Ukraine and Guderian southward from Smolensk for a pincer movement around the Soviet forces behind Kiev. By the end of September, the claws of the encircling movement had caught 520,000 men. These gigantic encirclements were partly the fault of the Soviet high commanders and partly the fault of Stalin, who as in commander-in-chief overrode advice of his generals and ordered his armies to fight instead of allowing them to retreat eastward and regroup for a counteroffensive. Bock's renewed advance began on December 2nd in 1941. His armies brought off a great encirclement around Vratsma, where 600,000 more Soviet troops were captured. But the Vratsma battle was not completed until late October. The country became a morass as the weather got worse, while the Germans slowly plodded forward. They were tired. In their path, fresh Soviet forces appeared. Some German generals wanted to break off the offensive, but Bock wanted to press on, believing that the Soviets were on the verge of collapse. The temptation of Moscow being so close at hand for the topmost leaders was too great to resist. Some German detachments penetrated to the suburbs of Moscow, where they were held up in the forest surrounding the city. The Russian winter was a most severe -40 degrees Fahrenheit in 1941. In October and November, a wave of frostbitten soldiers had decimated the ill-clad German troops without proper winter clothing. Also, the icy cold paralyzed the Germans' mechanized transport, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The Soviets, by contrast, were well clad and fought more effectively in winter than the Germans. By this time, German casualties mounted to unheard of levels of 230,000 men. In the south, Kleist had already reached Rostov-na-Donu, gateway to the Caucasus, on November 22nd, but had exhausted his tank's fuel. He then wanted to evacuate it, but was overruled by Hitler. A Soviet counteroffensive recaptured Rostov, and Rundstedt was relieved of his command 4 days later. As the drive against Moscow slackened, the Soviet commander on the Moscow front, General Zhukov, inaugurated the first great counteroffensive. Siberian troops, who were extremely effective fighters in winter weather, were used for these offensives. Here I jump the story a bit. In the north, Hitler wanted Leningrad, now being St. Petersburg, a big strategic port city on the Baltic Sea. Russia fortified it heavily. It could not be taken. The next objective was Stalingrad in the south, a bit smaller than Leningrad, now Volgograd. It was a major industry and transport hub on the Volga River. It was important to both the Russians and the Germans. Whoever would gain control of Stalingrad would have access to the oil fields of the Caucasus. Germany, already operating on dwindling fuel supplies, was operating on the oil fields. They would take them at any cost. The city was heavily bombed, and then both sides went into the city fighting intensely house to house. On February 2nd, 1943, the German army had exhausted their ammunition and food supply. They capitulated, and Hitler's first of his field armies surrendered. To make a very long story of the war with lots of details short, I stop here. I wrote a bit about it as my father was one of the soldiers in an artillery unit. He was killed early on in 1941 near the city of Gomel, which is north of Kiev and south of Minsk. The Battle of Stalingrad was the bloodiest battle in history. Total death count of Operation Barbarossa was staggering. Germans. Field army deaths 1,709,739. Missing, presumed dead 1,549,829. Civilian deaths 2,167,000 due to slave labor, expulsion, and imprisonment. In Russians, soldiers' deaths 8.6 million, including POWs. Civilian deaths 14 million. In the Stalingrad battle alone, Hitler sacrificed the lives of 300,000, some reports say more, of German soldiers. More than 90,000 of these ended up in Soviet prison camps. Only 6,000 survived and came home. This is a sad story, as even a greater number of Russian soldiers had to give their lives for defending their country. The Russians made a big point not to lose Stalingrad, as their president was Stalin, and the access to the oil fields, of course.